it will be your last material of the year, as hard as that might be to believe, but it is true. And it looks a lot, but it's not as much as we've had before. So what we're going to do is, like I mentioned, I gave you the handout on the colorful and colorless 60s. I really would like you to put that in your notes and keep those for, you know, college, etc., in case you have to write a paper. We talked about taking this notebook with you. And then we're going to move on. And these are the last things that I kind of pick and chose that I wanted to get through for the end of the year. So our overall topic is the election of Richard M. Nixon in 1969, a year to remember. And we're going to start with the election of 1968 because this is kind of an interesting election in general. We're going to talk about the Democratic Party first of all, and we talk about the election of 1868. And you got to remember the Democratic Party is really in disarray for a couple reasons. One, the incumbent president, which is really unusual, has made the decision under pressure not to run for re-election. That's really an unusual thing. And then the top candidate that looked like he was going to be the front runner to win the presidency, or at least win the Democratic nomination for president, was Robert Kennedy, who was assassinated. So who are the men that are seeking the nomination now? We've talked about one of them. So Eugene McCarthy, Senator of Minnesota, is one. But there's two others. And anybody want to take a guess who they might be?
George McGovern.
George McGovern, very good. She's an astute young lady. Who is George McGovern? Here's a picture of George McGovern right here. This is a signed picture of Life magazine I dug out. He actually moved to Stevensville, Montana when I was the assistant principal at Hamilton, which was like 30 miles away. And so, he jumped into the race. He was a senator from South Dakota, pretty well known for a small state. And he entered the race basically to keep the Robert Kennedy forces together. Okay, he was a supporter of Kennedy, and he was a friend of Kennedy's, and so he basically entered the Democratic nominational race, so to speak, because he wanted to keep the Kennedy forces together. Okay, people that were supporting Robert Kennedy, he believed would support him. Now, who else is the wild card here that you might be surprised is going to run for president? That you've been in the background. He's serving right now as Vice President of the United States, Hubert Humphrey. Remember, Hubert Humphrey is the Vice President of the United States right now. And he's kind of been in the back scenes, as most Vice Presidents are. But is he going to be a popular choice being the Vice President of Lyndon Johnson during the Vietnam War? No. Probably not. But he jumps into the race as well. So the Democratic Party has got some people seeking the nomination again. President Johnson's out of the race, Robert Kennedy's out of the race, the Democratic Party's kind of fragmented, but there still were three men that were seeking the Democratic nomination for president in 68. Eugene McCarthy, senator from Minnesota, which we talked about before. Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, who entered the race again just to keep the Kennedy forces together. And then Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey, which was a surprise to some, jumped into the race. Okay? That'll take us then to the Democratic National Convention, one of the most interesting events in our history. You know, we don't talk a lot about conventions. Usually they meet in the convention, then they nominate a president, a vice presidential candidate, and they go on with life. Well, this one was a little more interesting than most. Anybody know where the 1968 Democratic National Convention was? What big city? Take a guess.
Chicago.
Chicago. Very good. It was in Chicago. And it took place in August of 1968. And this convention would prove to be the absolute roughest convention on the part of the Democrats or Republicans in our country's history. It was going to be just a real brutal scene. Okay? Now, what is going to be the big issue at the convention among not only the people running for the offices, but the people that are outside the convention protesting? What's the Vietnam War? And you basically had two specific groups that met at the convention to show their opposition to the Vietnam War and try to get the Democrats to nominate people that were going to be in support of their beliefs. So the two specific groups that met at the convention to try to convince candidates about their opposition to the war, one was called MOBI. That was one group, MOBI. And it was a group of people that stood for the national mobilization to end the war in Vietnam. Okay, they call themselves MOBI, National Mobilization, to end the war in Vietnam. So it was just a bunch of people of all genders and races joined a group called MOBI, which stood for the National Mobilization to End the War in Vietnam. It was a group of people that were trying to campaign or lobby to have the war ended. And the other group were the Yippies, not the hippies. Don't get them confused, but the Yippies. Okay? And that stood for Youth International Party. So the group called MOBI, which was the National Mobilization to End the War in Vietnam, and the Yippies, which was the Youth International Party. And the man that led the Yippies, or the Youth International Party, at the convention was Abbie Hoffman. A guy by the name of Abbie Hoffman. And he was a radical fellow, white, and was very much against the Vietnam War. And actually the Yippies got a lot more publicity at the Democratic National Convention in 1968 than MOBI did. The Yippies were pretty out there, so to speak. Okay, now, put the Vietnam War aside, what other might be an issue they're talking about? What? Not yet, not yet.
Civil rights.
Civil rights. Okay, so the Black Panther, oh, that's right, so the Black Panther Party also had a group there to show their opposition to racism in the United States. Who else might have a group there that's nonviolent? SCLC, very good. The SCLC also had representatives in Chicago. So you had the MOBI, the National Mobilization and the Vietnam War group. You had the Yippies. You had the Black Panther Party that was there represented to talk about racism. You had the SCLC there. Okay, all registering complaints about different things. Some Vietnam, some racism. So you get all of these things together and it gets kind of interesting. Now, who's the mayor of Chicago? We should see if we remember this. Same guy that Richard Daley, that Kennedy was not going to cancel on. Do you remember during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Richard Daley, right up here is a picture of Richard Daley if you forgot. He's still the mayor of Chicago, okay? And he really sees, at first, he sees this as a great opportunity to promote the city of Chicago to the world by having this Democratic National Convention there. It's kind of a big deal to get a convention. Probably not as big a deal as getting a Super Bowl, which we talked about. But it's a big deal to get a convention because it brings people to town and you get to kind of show off your city. Well, Daley was really worried about these anti-war demonstrators and these Black Panthers, and not so much the SCLC, but just the combination of different viewpoints. He was really nervous about that, and he did not want to have any negative publicity in Chicago during this convention. So he put the city's 12,000 police officers on 12-hour shifts during the convention to try to prevent any problems, okay? Because he didn't want to see Chicago in a negative light during this convention, because it's kind of a big deal to get one. Well, he went a little overboard. Not only did he put the city's 12,000 police officers on 12-hour shifts, he also enlisted the help of 7,500 Army troops and 6,000 National Guardsmen, which really wasn't a bad idea to bring in 7,500 Army troops and 6,000 National Guardsmen, because what he's trying to do is what Kennedy learned the hard way, was trying to keep trouble happening before it happened, right? Because in the riots in Alabama and Mississippi and those types of places, remember, he brought in troops after the problem. Okay, so he was preparing, but it did lead to some dissension, as you might imagine. You go to the convention, all of a sudden you see all kinds of police officers, you see Army troops, and you see people in the National Guard, members of the National Guard. Well, the crowds gathered, began to protest, things became real disorderly throughout the convention, and violence broke out all over the convention. Just all over. And hundreds and thousands of arrests. So when the demonstrations had gotten out of hand on the part, or in the opinion of the Chicago Police Department, they stepped in. It became very disorderly. They started to forcefully arrest protesters, began to beat them, hit them with sticks. I mean, it was really a bad deal, okay? And it was kind of interesting because in the middle of all this, some of the people that didn't like the protesters, that didn't like what was going on, because of course, who was paying attention to all this? The Zack Spates of this world. Who was there? The media, television was there. And so these protesters, after watching their friends and colleagues and maybe even opponents getting beat and arrested, started chanting, "The whole world is watching. The whole world is watching." The whole world is watching. And that came over national television very clearly when they were covering this disorder at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. It was just a mess. And you'll get a chance to see an example of this when we get back next week, or the week after next, excuse me. Okay, well, many people were injured during this time. The police were viewed as very violent during this time. And all of this civil unrest was shown nightly, the American people, on national television. And when it all came out, guess who won the Democratic nomination for president from the Democratic Party? Because that was what this was all about. Hubert Humphrey. People were shocked because, here, the establishment candidate won. In other words, the person, what do I mean by the establishment candidate? The guy had already been involved in the establishment. Mr. Smith and Mr. Supas would be considered the establishment here. Okay, principal, vice principal. Okay, so when Humphrey gets the nomination, all these people are upset because they feel like the status quo is going to continue because Johnson's vice president has been nominated. Well, he then chooses Senator Edmund S. Muskie of Maine as his running mate. So when you get done with the Democratic convention and everything that went along with it, what comes out of it is Vice President Hubert Humphrey will be the presidential nominee for the election of 1968, and his running mate will be Senator Edmund S. Muskie of Maine. Edmund S. Muskie of Maine. So it'll be a Humphrey-Muskie ticket for the Democrats in 68. Okay? So we're done with the Democrats. It was a mess. You'll get a chance to see footage of this convention and you'll understand it. Okay, let's move on to the Republican Party. Okay? Who's the president now? Lyndon Johnson. He was elected in 64. Anybody remember who he defeated in 64 from Arizona?
Barry Goldwater.
Very good. Barry Goldwater. So when they get into the Republican Party, and they had their convention in Miami Beach, Florida in 1968, there were three candidates who decided they would be the front runners, or vied for the front runners of the party to be nominated. Who do you think? We've talked about two, and we haven't talked about one, but one's very popular in American politics. Who do you think the Republican nominees were in 68? Richard Nixon. Very good. He makes a comeback. He has to if he's going to be president, right? Remember, he's been out mad basically the last 8 years because he lost that very close decision to John Kennedy in 1960. So he decides to make a comeback, and he jumps in the race. So former Vice President Richard Nixon will vie for the Republican nomination. Who's he going to have to, who challenges is he going to have to fend off? Who else do you think? We've talked about one. No, good guess.
Nelson Rockefeller.
Nelson Rockefeller, Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York. Remember, in 1960, he and Nixon were vying for the Republican ticket, and they had to meet together, and they had to settle on a platform. Remember, Nixon wanted Rockefeller to run with him for president in 1960 and refused. So Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York decides he's going to try to get the nomination for the Republican ticket in 68. And the last one's a pretty darn good politician. If you talk about politicians in this country, people say he was #1. Turned out to be a president of the United States in later years. He was a governor of California at the time. Ronald Reagan. So Governor Ronald Reagan of California was the third one. So the three men that were vying for the Republican nomination for president in 1968 were former Vice President Richard Nixon, Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York, and Governor Ronald Reagan, and that's Ronald, but Reagan's R-E-A-G-A-N. Ronald Reagan of California. Well, surprisingly, Richard Nixon was nominated pretty easily on the first ballot, and then he chose Spiro T. Agnew, who was the governor of Maryland, as his running mate. So Nixon was nominated on the first ballot, and he chose Spiro T. Agnew, governor of Maryland, as his running mate. I'll tell you in a preview, we won't get that far, but I'm going to give you some notes I want you to have after we're done here. Agnew chooses not to be a real good choice for him. Okay? So Nixon, it'll be a Nixon-Agnew ticket for the Republicans.
Agnew was governor of where?
Maryland. So you got a Nixon-Agnew ticket for the Republicans, and you got a Humphrey-Muskie. Now, if you were to think about this overall, how do you think this is going to come out? Who's going to win? By a large margin or what? Because he's running. Okay, we'll see how it goes. Okay, let's talk about the campaign. there were three major campaign issues in this election, and I know you're going to get two of them right off the bat. What's one? Vietnam War. What was the other one? Civil rights. Very good. What's the third one? And who was I talking? Who gave a presentation on? Was that you? Okay, what's the third one?
Economy? The campaign was like food, not food stamps, but like food distribution.
But you and I talked about it. You said this. I was
hostility in non-US.
very good. Violence and disorder was the third campaign issue, because you got to think about all the how much violence and disorder we had in this decade. A lot. So it became a huge campaign issue. So the Vietnam War, I'll give you an example of that. 60% of Americans believed that the Vietnam War is being badly managed during this campaign. 60% of Americans thought that the Vietnam War was being handled badly. Okay? So there's your first campaign issue, Vietnam, and 60% of Americans believe the war was being badly managed. Civil rights. Now this is kind of interesting because there were a majority of black citizens that were convinced that the civil rights movement was not going fast enough, right? But there were a lot of white citizens that thought the civil rights struggle was going way too fast. So you had a lot of problems still with civil rights, okay? And that's going to continue for a long time, okay? So when you talk about civil rights, the campaign issue, a majority of black citizens thought the movement was going too slow. A majority of white citizens thought the movement was going too fast. And if you ever need an example of that, get on TV if you can get on to All in the Family and watch Archie Bunker talk about that. It's just incredible. I've got a lot of those I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you one on Vietnam here. Okay, now we talk about violence and disorder, the third major issue. 7 out of every 10 Americans were convinced that law and order had completely broken down in the United States at the time of this election. 70%, or 7 out of every 10 Americans believed, they didn't believe, they were convinced that we had no law and order in the United States of America. That was a really big campaign issue. It might surprise you, but it was. Because we'd seen all of this craziness go on during the course of the decade from 1960 to 1968. So, these are the campaign issues. And Nixon or Humphrey, neither one was that hot on. And when somebody figures out that the country's not hot on either candidate, what does this person normally do? He's kind of astute in politics. Well, what might he do, though, besides that? He might throw himself into the ring and run because he's thinking, hell, nobody really cares about Nixon, or Humphrey's not getting any publicity, so I'm going to jump in the race. So a third party, the American Independent Party, was established, and they nominated a candidate for president as well. Who do you think their candidate was? Governor George Wallace of Alabama. Who said that? Sarah, very good. So Wallace is going to be in there. Now you study this, don't be bashful, you know this. Governor George Wallace is going to be the American Independent Party candidate. So you're going to have 3 parties. The Republicans with Nixon, the Democrats with Humphrey, and now you're going to have the American Independent Party with Wallace running for president. Now, did Wallace really think he could win the general election? No, but what was his strategy? Does anybody know what his strategy might be? Well, maybe, but he still knows he's not going to get enough votes to win the general election. What do you have to win the general election? You have to have 2/3 majority in the Electoral College. What happens if nobody has that? Anybody know? If you know anything about Andrew Jackson's presidency, you would know that. What's that? No. That's interesting, because popular vote and I don't know, maybe a popular vote and $1 will buy you a pop in the pop machine. It doesn't mean much. Popular vote gives the electoral votes. What happens in American politics if somebody runs an election and does not get the number of electoral votes? No? No. Which branch? You got a 50-50 chance, Irvin Child. Don't screw it up. The House votes. The House votes. This happened in an election with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson got the most electoral votes way back when. And he did not get enough electoral votes to win, so went to the House, and the House supported Henry Clay. Excuse me. Henry Clay had the 3rd amount of votes, so Henry Clay got thrown out, so he supported Henry Clay supported Jackson's opponent, Adams, and then Adams was elected president because the House played politics. And what did Adams do with Henry Clay, who threw his support to Adams? He put him into his cabinet. And Jackson called that a corrupt bargain for the rest of his life. So what happens is if a president doesn't get enough electoral votes to win, it goes to the House and the House decides. Wallace really believed that none of the candidates would get the electoral votes needed, and he felt that if it went into the House, he had enough supports among the House of Representatives to be given the presidency. He really believed that. Obviously that did not happen. So Wallace's goal was to try to keep both Humphrey and Nixon from getting the majority vote of electoral votes in the election, and he thought he could get involved in the House and he could be the next president. Okay? That's what his strategy was. He knew he couldn't win overall. Okay, let's talk about the candidates and what their views are on those three major campaign issues. Okay, and we'll start with George Wallace. So think about George Wallace here. You guys are doing really good. We've got Vietnam, we've got civil rights, and we've got law and order. Which of those three did Wallace could care less about? George Wallace, civil rights. There'll be segregation in the state of Alabama today, tomorrow, and forever. So he didn't, as far as civil rights, he was not into civil rights. He opposed all existing welfare programs, because who did most of those people, most of that go to at the time? Blacks. He opposed federal legislation that integrated anything. Okay, right? So think about that. He's going to oppose any welfare programs. Why? Because the people that were getting welfare at that time, the majority were black. Okay, he also opposed, remember the federal government integrating by law, saying you have to have these kids, black kids in your school? He opposed all that. So civil rights was something that he didn't shy away from it. He didn't just ignore it so he wouldn't get in trouble. He made it real clear in the campaign he didn't support welfare and he didn't support integration. He said that. Okay, what about Vietnam? What was his philosophy in Vietnam? I'll save that till last. What did he really hammer on? What did he really